Well, hello, Whiskey family across the globe. Welcome to our Whiskey Wednesday, live with myself, Richie Michaels. I'm the Uncle Nearest brand ambassador for the US. And joining us today, we have a very special guest. We are joined by ET. ET is the national brand ambassador for the Jack Daniel Distillery. So we are absolutely delighted to have him on today. And we also have, as ever, our beautiful producer. Introduce yourself, Sailor.
I'm Sailor. I'm the brand ambassador for the PNW, and I'm really thrilled to have you here tonight, ET. I think this is going to be a super fun evening, and I can't wait to hear all the questions that are going to come in.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm psyched to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, this is going to be great. ET, I got to tell you, out of all the Whiskey Wednesdays that we've done so far, this has probably been the one that we've had the most response from. People are most excited to hear what you have to say about Tennessee whiskey,
right,
and hearing about our company and our relationship. But before we get started on that, it's always nice to get to know the people that are our guests on the show. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about your history in the whiskey industry and how you got to the position you are now?
Good. So yeah, I come from the bar business in Los Angeles. I started bartending just say a while ago. And I worked in nightclubs on the Sunset Strip for years and years during like the Roxbury days. If some of you much younger people have seen At Night at the Roxbury, that was a real place. And somewhere around 2000, I got a job at my favorite bar. Just as luck would have it, it just worked out. And that bar was a big Jack Daniel's account, and I was a big Jack Daniel's fan. I guess my love for Jack went all the way back, just to the myth of Jack Daniel's. My father was all Sinatra all the time, and he force-fed Sinatra on me as a kid, and my mother basically bred me rock and roll in utero, and both those worlds meet at Jack Daniel's. So when I made the connection, of course, when I was 21, I had to try it, and as
of course,
right? And then as an adult, you can do whatever you want with your life, and the whiskey in the bottle just kept bringing me back. And it just, my love for the brand and its cultural impact and all that stuff just kind of kept growing. And then when I got to that gig, it was a very big Jack account, so all the Jack people and the Jack reps would come in there. So they got to know me, and I knew they were Jack reps, so I would always hit them up like for a hat or a shirt or something. And eventually they realized I was a little obsessed with the brand, and an opportunity came up to host a dinner for Single Barrel. So they asked me to do it, and that just kind of turned into this job and this job and this job. And before you know it, they're like, well, this guy's not leaving, we should just hire him.
Like, this guy knows more than ourselves.
I will tell you, man, the first gig was pretty casual. The second gig was pitched to me as pretty casual, but it was in a banquet room. People paid, I don't know, $150 a ticket, suit and tie and dresses, and packed with people from Brown-Forman, our distributor, this club of like obsessed Jack fans. And I didn't know anything about the event, and the guy who ran the venue said, "Hi, welcome. This is our barrel tasting dinner. Thanks for being here. And here's your host, ET." And that was the last time anyone spoke but me for 2 hours.
Oh,
and
wow.
the second gig, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be outed as such a fraud. But somehow, the little notes I wrote on my hand got me through it. Jack Daniel was a real man.
Midway through.
Yeah. Like, wait a minute, what's our mash bill? Darn it.
Daniel, what is that?
Yeah.
It's funny. What makes me think when you're talking just then, I was thinking Jack is such a quintessential brand that everybody who drinks whiskey has had some kind of experience and memory with drinking Jack. I think it'll be fun. Can you post and ask our viewers if they can post any of their just lifelong memories and what they think of when they think of Jack Daniel? That might be interesting. But ET, do you have a moment, like a very vivid moment that you remember from your, let's say, 21-year-old days of what it brings you back to?
Yeah, I mean, look, probably at that era, that's right out of college. So I am an obsessed Zeppelin fan, and you know, I think at that age I was really revisiting their entire catalog, and I came across that picture of Jimmy Page, let's just say sipping whiskey out of the bottle backstage in Indianapolis. And that was like, what brought me back into the fold where I'm like, yeah, I got to go check that stuff out. And, like I said, that got me there and Sinatra got me there. And then the whiskey, I do have one funny-ish story. Back in the early 90s, I was in New York with some friends, and one of the friends' dad was there, and he owned a car dealership, but he presented himself like he was a mob boss. He always was dressed impeccably, everything, beautiful, and he just had that quiet, I can make you disappear kind of vibe. And
Yeah.
I remember ordering, we went to some hotel bar after dinner, and everyone ordered, and the server came to me, and I think I said Jack and Coke, and he gave me a look like that. If looks could kill, I'm like, what? He's like, you don't ruin your whiskey with Coca-Cola. I'm like, what do you do? And he's like, you drink it like a man. I'm like, what is like? And literally, I'm like, oh my God, I've been doing it wrong this whole time. And then it wasn't until much later when I discovered you should drink things however you like to drink them. But he was just intimidating enough where I went right to Jack Rocks. But later in life, I came back to enjoy things how you want to enjoy them.
Exactly. That's the beautiful part about whiskey. It's all perspective. It's all personal opinion. There's no right or wrong, and that's what makes it so cohesive for all of our consumers out there. Is that nobody is ever wrong. It's
No,
exactly
never.
how you want to do it. It's what you're tasting. It's all love and cohesiveness, and everybody's right. So
What's funny is I left the spirits industry for a hot minute and ended up in the music business unexpectedly in Europe. And I was putting tours together, and I would get riders, and it would always be Jack Daniels, Jack Daniels, Jack Daniels. And so I started asking, all the musicians, I'm like, well, is there another whiskey that you want? And half of them would be like, yeah, whatever, it's fine, whatever. And then the other half would be like, no, it has to be Jack Daniels. And it was the Europeans that were like, no, it has to be Jack Daniels. And the Americans were like, yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. Every time.
Sounds pretty American, right? I actually, years and years ago, I guess it was the 90s also, my mother was famous for every year, because I live in California, my family's in Philly. So once every year, every 2 years, she would try to get my father, my mother, my sister, and I together somewhere. And it almost felt like she just threw a dart at the map of the US, and wherever it landed, she would say, let's go there. And one year was Nashville. And we were there for like 3 days doing, all the honky tonks and dinner and checking stuff out. My sister had to get back to work, so she left, and we had one more day. And I was somehow in the lobby before my parents, which is odd to me that happened. But I was asking the person at the front desk, like, what's cool? What should I see? We've done this. We've done this. She's like, well, did you go to Jack Daniels? I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, it's only like an hour away. I'm like, the place it's made is an hour from here? She goes, yes. My parents got to the lobby, like, what should we do today? I'm like, I know what we're doing. There's not even a discussion here. We're going. And it was cool. That was, I guess, that was the first time I actually really thought about anything besides just a bottle of Jack and the whiskey in the bottle, where the history came out of it. And I started really delving into Jack was a real guy, and this is where he made whiskey and all that good stuff. So that was probably like my first real memory of something other than the pop culture side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my first real memories of Jack. Again, I'll say that I was 21
right
at the time as well. And in England, where I'm from, Jack is really the number one whiskey over any British or European or Scotches. Jack Daniel is number one. It really is king in the whiskey industry. It's almost the well whiskey in just about all of the pubs and bars around England. So I can remember being very young and people letting me sip their Jack and Cokes in pubs in England. That was really my first kind of taste of American whiskey. And it's such a very recognizable, distinctive taste. Jack and Coke. When you sip it, you know that it's Jack Daniel in there in that glass. So yeah, so it just sticks with you forever. So so ET, what I wanted to talk about today.
Yes.
Now we got you all introduced, and everyone knows ET intimately and all his personal stories. The part stuff that I really wanted to talk about today was the relationship between not just Jack Daniel the man and Nearest Green the man, but the relationship between Jack Daniel the distillery and Nearest Green the distillery as well. Because when we are out doing presentations and dinners, etc., about Uncle Nearest, we get a lot of questions about exactly that. And I'll say the number one question that I always get, which I'll pose to you right now, ET, the number one question I always get is, so is Uncle Nearest owned by Jack Daniel? That's the number one question.
Yeah, no, hey, it's not, I like to say that's unique to you out in the world, but we get all those same questions. And no, we're 100% different companies that share a lot of history, especially in the beginnings. And it's funny, when I first started those little jobs I was doing for Jack, I was like, I really need to learn more. And there's not a lot of public information out there about the history of Jack Daniel. And that the first thing I ever found was that Jack Daniel Legacy book. I found a copy that was like, I bought it on Amazon, I think, when you could still get that version of it. And, it was like $1. And I think shipping costs 4 times as much as the book. And, when I read that book, that's when I really started reading about Nearest Green. In the early days of Jack, when he was living on the Dan Call farm as a kid. I mean, I get different numbers all the time, but if you believe that book, Jack was like 8 years old when he left. And I mean, even younger when he went to his neighbor, but about 8 or so when he got to the Dan Call farm and took a real interest in whiskey making. And eventually, Dan Call thought Jack was a good kid and a hustler. And he introduced him to Nearest, who ran the still, and kind of said to Nearest, hey, man, you're in charge of teaching this kid how to make whiskey. And that really formed a relationship that just lasted. And it's not unlike now. And, when people ask me, aren't they your competitors? Why would you even talk to them? To me, life is too short to sit around and be bothered and angry or, have weird, odd feelings about a competitor. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, there's a bazillion whiskeys on the market. You know what I mean? If I spent all my days worrying about the rest of the world's whiskeys and spirits and people aren't buying Jack, they're buying beer, I would go nuts. It's just not worth it. And to me, our distiller, Jeff, really says it best. He says, the category of Tennessee whiskey is nowhere near as big as the category of bourbon in terms of what people know and think. And, bourbon's the spirit of the U.S. and all that stuff. So anytime great companies and great whiskeys are out there, lifting the concept of Tennessee whiskey, that's good for all Tennessee whiskey,
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's, having you guys come into the fold, especially with great history and, great people working for the brand, it only helps the category, which ultimately only helps all of us. And, we see it today all the time, right? We're in a very odd piece of history right now that no one's really experienced in our lifetimes. So the one thing I do notice is how much people are bonding together and loving each other and helping each other, and brands are looking out for each other. But even more than that, just people are looking out for each other. When I'm walking my dogs now, I'm somehow friendlier than I ever was to my neighbors, like more, hi, how are you? Do you need anything kind of vibe? And the more I see that kind of world, the more this makes more sense. Like, why wouldn't we be nice to each other, right? We're in this together. And one day when we're all gone, wouldn't you rather be known as, hey, good guy, good, that was a really nice woman. So, yes, we don't own you and you don't own us, but we own something together, and, we're here together.
Yeah, absolutely. The relationship between Jack and Nearest, the men, that was occurring in a time in U.S. history when it was a very, very unlikely loving relationship. And it kind of just resembles that same way in our relationships with our companies today. It's a very, in theory, we should be competitors, but we share a history, and we share a heritage, and we share a common goal of wanting to make fantastic whiskey that elevates the category of Tennessee whiskey. And so, although to the outsider it might look like we should be competitors, we're really not. We have a lot of the same goals in our work lives. We really do work alongside each other beautifully. So it's kind of a unique situation. Before we came on, me and Sailor were talking about our good buddy Bernie Lubbers as well. And so he's the brand ambassador for Heaven Hill, and Heaven Hill, you cannot talk about Heaven Hill without talking about the Beam family. Right. It's an absolute part of their history and their heritage. And so it's a kind of similar scenario there, but it's a similar scenario in a lot of American whiskey distilleries. You cannot talk about one without having some kind of combined history and heritage with another distillery. It's very so common.
Many, even Jack Daniel himself, his brother had a distillery. It never made it even to Prohibition, but everyone back then, that especially where they were from, that's what people did. That was good business. And a lot of that intersected. A lot of families split off and someone went and did this, and in that situation, there was a big history between one family that launched two distilleries. So it's it's pretty intertwined. It's not the biggest world in the world.
I love that we share a story, to be honest. I mean, when I'm out in the market, it's interesting because we have so many different places we can come from to tell our story as a brand now. We can tell it from Fawn's perspective. We can tell it from our, what's in our bottle. We can tell it from Jack's perspective. It's just so interesting and fascinating. And one of the things I love now is when I see other Brown-Forman representatives, it's immediately like, hey, we're cousins in a way, like, how's it going? We're family. And we say that about whiskey, and I think whiskey is very unique in that I don't ever feel like I'm in competition with any other whiskey brand. We all know that it's not milk. You have several different, how many brands of whiskey does every person have on their shelf? Several different brands, right? We can absolutely live together. But it's fun, honestly, for me when I get the questions, oh, well, what does Jack Daniels think about what you guys are doing? And I'm like, what do you mean? What do they think about what we're doing? They think it's great, and we think it's great. It's all great.
And it is. I mean, I know Jeff, our distiller, he hosts other distillers from Tennessee all the time because they're all just starting out. So, we have 150 some year head start on a lot of the newer Tennessee whiskeys, and they come and he'll show them everything. We're not worried like, oh my God, you're going to hear the grain bill of Jack Daniels, open a distillery, 8 miles down the road and make Jack Daniels. It's everything's different. I mean, look how many whiskeys there are. I remember being at a bar years ago and, hundreds of bourbons. And at the time, 2 Tennessee whiskeys. So it takes, 150 bourbons to describe the bourbon category just because there's so much nuance. But at the time, there's really only 2 brands really pushing the story of Tennessee. So to me, I think Tennessee whiskey is so special and unique. The more people telling the story, the better it is for Tennessee whiskey.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're all out there promoting the same thing, trying to hit the same goals, and make this category better. Because it is one of the less understood whiskey categories. There's a lot of kind of myths to Tennessee whiskey that people don't necessarily understand or have the right information about. So it's a lot. A part of our job as well is a lot of educating consumers about Tennessee whiskey, and dispelling some of the myths that are out there. Which,
right.
Which takes me to some of my other questions I have for you.
Wait, before you do that, we have a very special guest with us. Well, everybody's special, but Fawn and Keith Weaver are in the room, so to speak. And Fawn says, this is a question for ET, what's his favorite way to drink Jack? Still on the rocks, or do you have a drink that you love with Jack Daniels in specific?
Good question. Hi, Fawn. Yeah, so Jack Rocks is my go-to. Now, however, for some reason during this, quarantining, I've started drinking Jack neat. So my go-to is 2 fingers of Jack and a soda water back. Tonight, however, because I'm on with you guys, my drink is 2 fingers of Jack and Uncle Nearest back.
I love it.
And then since I have whiskey behind whiskey, I went for the giant water. But typically it's 2 fingers of Jack soda water back or Jack Rock soda water back. I try to go 1 and 1, right? So 1 drink, 1 glass of water, 1 drink, 1 glass of water. You know, I think in our community and in I guess all communities, we can't talk enough about being responsible when you're drinking. So what's always worked for me is hydrating. Is just making sure I force myself to drink a glass of water. Because the whole fun of being out and being with your friends and having a drink, it's not really about having the drink. It's about being with your friends, right? So if it was only about the drink, we'd all just sit home, turn off the computer, and just drink. But we want that connection, and now we really crave that connection. So for me, if I'm going to have a drink and a water and a drink, I'll be there all night enjoying my friends and making great memories versus not drinking the water and then maybe at 8:30 I got to go home. You know what I mean? So this way I get to be there for the whole party.
So what I heard you say was that you love sipping on Uncle Nearest and Jack Daniels equally with water.
Your headphones are, I don't know what brand that is that you're using, but I love sipping on good whiskey. Yes, that's what you heard. Yes.
Yeah, and ET, you sip on Uncle Nearest while you're on your Jack Daniel conference calls at work, I'm sure, right?
Always,
Looking out for us,
always.
buddy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's either Uncle Nearest or another, Tennessee whiskey or bourbon. Always. Never Jack.
You see, viewers, this is how much Jack Daniel loves us. This is how much they love us. ET is just one example of everyone at Jack, of his beautiful love that he has for Uncle Nearest. So, ET,
Yes.
I have some questions for you, because a big part of our job as brand ambassadors is dispelling some of the myths that are out there with Tennessee whiskey, educating people, elevating the category, and gaining people's more and more respect for Tennessee whiskey with our consumers. So I have a little fact or myth for you. I'm going to read you some questions.
Right.
Are you ready for them, though?
I think so.
Okay, let's see what we can do. Oh, and by the way, Keith Wheeler, you can't have this.
Everybody wants
buddy,
it.
It's all mine. But maybe ET will send you one. We'll see.
Know a guy.
Okay, so ET. Question number 1, fact or myth? The Lincoln County process eliminates Tennessee whiskey from being able to be called bourbon. Fact or myth?
I'm going to have to go with myth on that. We could call ourselves bourbon. We choose not to because of how we make our whiskey, and it's a little bit different than bourbon, so we like to call it something a little bit different. It's funny, a lot of people, that's an argument I have with a lot of people, right? Jack Daniels is bourbon, and they try to tell me it's bourbon. And another great quote from one of our distillers, Chris Fletcher, the assistant master distiller, he says, look, if somebody wants to tell me Jack Daniels is the greatest bourbon on the planet, okay, I'm not going to disagree, right? Because it technically could be bourbon, but the Lincoln County process, which, Nearest Green learned at some point when he learned how to distill, and then Jack learned it from Nearest. And, depending on what source you read, I've read it goes all, the first person that ever used it was back in 1825, Albert or Alfred Eaton or something. So it's something that they all learned. And I look, from what I've read, I think it probably came from Africa, from their distilling techniques, and was brought to America. And then, because of that knowledge of distilling, I think a lot of slaves were in charge of the stills back before emancipation because they had all this knowledge of distilling. And, after Prohibition, I think Jack Daniels was the only company that continued charcoal mellowing because it was really expensive. It's an expensive, time-consuming process. And after Prohibition, people just wanted to get whiskey in the barrel and get it aged and get it sold. And Jack's nephew, who was running the distillery at the time, said Uncle Jack always charcoal mellowed. We're going to keep doing that. And then it started becoming the Tennessee thing, and now it's law.
Absolutely. Yeah. Since 2013, when the bill was signed in for Tennessee whiskey by Governor Haslam, it's now a required process that you have to use that Lincoln County process or charcoal mellowing that in Tennessee and with Jack Daniel originated with the man nearest green, was the one who introduced that to Jack in that little town of Lynchburg, and it is now law that you have to use that technique that nearest introduced there if you want to be called Tennessee whiskey. So he truly is the godfather of Tennessee whiskey, people. He truly is.
The thing that's funny too, because when people say there's so many, and Keith, we can hook a brother out with a hat. Just like every bourbon, you can put 8, 10, 20, 30 bourbons next to each other, and the nuances of how they're made and their yeast and their grain bills and how they're aged, it's going to come out different in every barrel. So, I always like to say too that just because we all use some version of the Lincoln County process, that doesn't mean all Tennessee whiskey is the same, right? So there's so many other factors, and that probably on the chain of what makes the whiskey have its uniqueness isn't one or two, right? The barrel is always going to be number one. Yeast most likely is number two. So, but it does change the whiskey and how you change it, how you charcoal mellow. I've been to some distilleries, because the law really is, I think you just have to touch charcoal. So you could, pour new make bourbon over charcoal, let it pour right out of the bottom, put in a barrel, and now you're making Tennessee whiskey. Or you can do different ways. Jack does it much different than that. I'm sure you guys do it different than that. So, you're still going to get more nuances on top of what you're starting with already. So it's just, to me, it's fun and it's geeky because every whiskey is different. Like you were saying, there's not much nuance between milk, right? But when you get to whiskey, there's a lot. There's a lot.
No doubt. Okay, so for everyone out there, the answer is myth. Lincoln County process does not eliminate you from being able to be called bourbon. And a fun fact as well, the government body that oversees the approval of labeling in the whiskey industry is called the TTB. And Tennessee whiskey, for the majority of the time, we actually file with the TTB as bourbon. So because there isn't actually a category for Tennessee whiskey. So we file as bourbon and we legally can. And then we're given the choice of whether we want to put that word bourbon on our label or not. But as an ode to Jack and to Nearest Green and their amazing techniques that they brought to the industry,
that was
of
also,
course, we label it Tennessee whiskey.
It's also something that was fought for back in the day too. After Prohibition, when Jack's nephew was running the distillery, the government basically said you have to put bourbon on your label. You're not bourbon. And back and forth, they finally brought samples of uncharcoal mellowed new make whiskey and charcoal mellowed new make whiskey, and they tasted and smelled it and determined it was different enough from bourbon that they could call it Tennessee whiskey. So it's not just a thing we do, it really is part of what makes Tennessee whiskey special.
Exactly. So that is a myth. All right, number 2 is the term sour mash is a production technique only used in Tennessee whiskey. Fact or myth?
We go myth again. That's a funny one, man. I bartended for so long, and that was a question I could have never answered the first 10 years I bartended. But as we all kind of went with the new way of bartending and learned new things and kind of got into the whole cocktail revolution, customers would come to the bar and they would ask me what kind of whiskey they should have in their old fashioned. And, even before the job, I was always the Jack fan. So I would suggest, Jack or single barrel. And I can't tell you how many times somebody would say to me, oh, I just don't like that sour mash. It's got that weird sour taste. I'm like, oh, odd. I'm like, and you don't want to shame your customers. So you're like, oh, actually, I kind of think, I think, I'm not sure, but I think just about every aged whiskey in America uses the sour mash process. No. I'm like, I'll Google it later. and then hopefully they'll do the same. But no, myth.
Definite myth. And so for our viewers out there who might be a little bit confused as to, they might be thinking, I thought that meant Tennessee whiskey. So what does sour mash mean? It's a technique that's used during fermentation, where you use a little portion of the fermented grains, and you take them and put them back into the fermentation tank and use it to restart a new fermentation. And it's referred to as sour mash because the fermentation becomes sour during the 3-day or 4-day process. And so that little portion that you're taking back and putting into the new fermentation is a sour tasting fermented grain. So it's a process that is used in fermentation. The alternative process is sweet mash, and that means that you just use a completely fresh set of grains to ferment with every time. So
also, you hear a lot of, that's good, very good. Myth dispelled. You hear a lot of people too say, "Oh, our yeast strain, our proprietary, our yeast goes all the way back to XYZ." And the reason people say that, distillers are very protective of their yeast. And I think at Jack, we keep freeze-dried yeast at Woodford and Old Forester. God forbid anything happens to Jack, we have a way to, get that strain back. And I think legally we can say the yeast goes back to Prohibition. We just don't have any paperwork or a letter that says from Jack Daniel to his nephew, here's the secret yeast formula, and his nephew saying I used Uncle Jack's yeast formula, but I'm sure it goes back to Jack. Why would they change it? But legally we can say Prohibition.
That piece of that document is probably still stuck in that safe that Jack was trying to keep open. That's probably where it is, bud.
So I have one of my girls, a couple of them here, actually. I do a Women in Whiskey meetup every Wednesday night. And here in, actually I'm expanding it now to all of Washington State. And so we've been doing it virtually, of course. And tonight after this, because it's only 5:30 in the Pacific Northwest, at 7 p.m. here, we meet up, and we're going to be talking about yeast tonight and going down that awesome rabbit hole. So the girls are really excited.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool. And we got a comment from Melissa saying that sour mash is kind of like a starter in baking, and yeah, it's kind of a similar process. That's a good comparison.
Sourdough, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Do we have any other questions?
Nope. Next one. You can go on to the next one.
All right. Okay. This one should be interesting, ET. So, fact or myth? No one knows. Oh, hold on. No one knows what old number 7 brand means. Fact or myth? I'm asking all the hard questions today.
Yeah, all those hard-hitting questions that people must know. Fact-ish. We don't really. There's so many. Even in that book, there's at least 2 or 3 theories that were told to the author of that book, and that author interviewed every living descendant of Jack Daniel, and he even had more than one answer. Jack never. There's no proof of anything that Jack ever wrote down and said, "This is why old number 7." People think, Jack was never married, so the 7 great loves of his life, or the 7th recipe for Jack Daniel, or the train that brought the whiskey out of Lynchburg was the number 7 train. There's all these crazy theories. One I heard that I love is, back in the day, if you needed to order whiskey, and really early, Jack would sell by the barrel like most whiskey makers. So if someone telegraphed or wrote a letter to Jack and said, I needed a barrel of whiskey, let's say, he's in Tennessee, let's say it was out west. We'd have to get on a horse and buggy, get on a train, maybe get to a port, get on a boat, get back on a train, take months and months to get there. And one of these customers telegrammed months later and said, hey, where's my barrel? So Jack tried to trace the points of where it would have stopped. No one's seen it. So being a good guy, he sent another barrel. And when it got to New Orleans, to the port, the guy that ran the warehouse goes, oh my God, that's what he was talking about. We still have that barrel, and sent both out west. And when the guy finally needed new whiskey, he said, hey, I ended up getting both those barrels. I need whiskey again. The barrel with the number 7 on it was by far the best whiskey you ever made. And the theory is, Jack numbered all the barrels. That one sat in a warehouse for upwards of a year and aged an extra year. And Jack thought that was cute and put the 7 on the barrel. And there's absolutely 100% no truth to anything I just said. So it's just a story I heard. So whenever anyone asks me what's the story, I'm like, you know what? Make one up. No one can refute you.
Yeah.
Just whatever you think's the best story, go with that one.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that that Jack actually never wrote down specifically what he meant by old number 7 brand. It's such a quintessential revolving piece of his product. It's just wild to me that he never physically wrote that down.
Look, he might have. There was 2 fires in Lynchburg, so
that's true. It could have gone in the fire. Yeah,
absolutely. But you would also think it's such an integral part of our label that he would have told his, and maybe he told his nephew, "Hey, this is between you and me. Don't tell anyone." And he said, "Okay." Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? So the only real kind of evidence that we've come across in well, I say we, I honestly mean Fawn Weaver. She's the one who does all the research. She's just such a talented historian, and the only real kind of leaning towards evidence that we found is the switching of his distillery number. So he was originally in district number 5. Sorry, he was originally in district number 7. And he was originally in I forget, it was either 4 or 5, and he was distillery number 7. Right. And then he got switched to a different district, and his distillery number changed to number 16.
I don't know. I think the one thing I read about somewhat similar that you're talking about is a book called Blood and Whiskey, which a lot of stuff I'm not sure has been proven, but he talks about the county that Jack was in, and when the county lines moved, he was worried that people would think something about Jack changed, so he put old number 7 to remind him that's where he came from. And there is that's a chicken and egg story, I think. Like, did it start fall into district number 4, distillery number 7?
Yeah, district 4, distillery number 7, and then he switched to district 5, distillery number 16. But he didn't want to lose that distillery number 7 branding. So
that seems the most plausible.
Started stamping his barrels with distillery 16, the old number 7. That's and who knows? But that's the closest that we've come to finding some real solid evidence about what that brand means.
I think it's called Blood and Whiskey where that theory comes from, but it's tough because maybe it was distillery 7, so it would make sense that would be the story, but that's only us reading the book without anyone from Jack's side saying that's what it was. So who knows? Again, I say make up a good one and stick with that.
We have Fawn has some really cool newspaper clippings from when that switch in distillery numbers happen. So we'll check with her first, but maybe we can post the pictures of those newspaper clippings in the comments. Maybe.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, that would be really cool. We'll check with her first though. Okay, so next question for you, ET. Fact or myth? The first bottle of Jack Daniel, or the first brand that Jack Daniel had, was the old number 7 black label brand. Fact or myth?
I'm gonna have to go myth. And if Fawn's still on, she can confirm. But I'm pretty sure the first brand that Jack made was called Belle of Lincoln, and that predated old number 7. I think the old number 7 brand came after Belle of Lincoln. And then years later, I think there was even a commemorative Belle of Lincoln bottle. I've seen some at the distillery, but I don't know the exact dates, but I'm almost positive that Belle of Lincoln predated old number 7. And I'm almost curious if old number 7 was even made until he got to Lynchburg. So I'm curious, because if we are talking about the district and distillery, that probably would have been Lynchburg, not
She
Yeah.
said confirmed the first brand was Belle of Lincoln.
Yeah, yeah. And if I remember right, Belle of Lincoln had a very a beautiful bottle. It
I think
wasn't
the
the
bottle
same.
you're talking about came later as a commemorative bottle. I don't know
Okay.
that was the original bottle. I've seen a bottle of it where it was also square, and you know, I think in 1895 when Jack's nephew was doing a lot of the stuff around the distillery and bottling was becoming a thing, you know, Jack found these square bottles and everyone's like, go round. Everyone does round. It makes so much more sense. And he's like, well, we do things a little bit different here at Jack, so our bottle should be different. And we went square. So, and stuck. I think there was one time in history where it wasn't square because the manufacturer ran out and they just had to bottle something. So I think there is a period where there was a round bottle for a second.
Oh wow! And that bottle is worth $1 million now.
$1 billion.
Right.
If it's full and unopened, yeah, it's probably worth a lot.
All right, last one. Fact or myth? ET secretly voted for me and Sailor at the World Whiskey Awards this year. Fact or myth, ET?
Yeah, at the
because
where?
I know you had a Brown Forman person nominated for the Whiskey Ambassador Award as well.
Yeah, I always vote for you, whatever it is.
See, viewers, that's what I'm talking about. It's all
I voted
love.
for you as the person who wears the Jack Daniel's hat the best.
Yes.
Yes, because I didn't have the hat, but instead of the hat, I do have this, so that's okay. So I took the prize, so it's all right.
There you go.
You can keep the hat, Richie.
By the way,
your vote contributed to that.
When I sent Richie a care package, I don't remember him offering your address.
Oh!
Oh wow! Under the bus.
Oh, that's cold. Wow! Ouch!
We'll take care. We'll take care of it.
We'll get you what you need. We'll get you what you need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, two things. I have a few questions on the pipeline, and then Miss Sherry Moore, one of my favorite people in the world, says the Belle of Lincoln decanter was not the shape of the original. I think, she says.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a square bottle at our visitor center of Belle of Lincoln, and then I've also seen. I think that Belle of Lincoln decanter came much later, like even in my lifetime later. So, but yeah, she would know probably better than me. But yeah, she spent a lot more time there.
Yeah. For any of our viewers who don't know who Sherry Moore is, she is our amazing director of distillery operations at Uncle Nearest. But another connection between our two companies, Sherry worked at the Jack Daniel Distillery for 31 years, from 1985 to 2006, and retired as the director of distillery operations at Jack Daniel.
But she didn't retire, right?
That's she started her sabbatical from whiskey in 2006 before she came to Uncle Nearest when we started almost 3 years ago now. Yeah.
So I have a few questions here, but before we go into the questions, Fawn says, on the question of the distillery numbers, definitely don't pay attention to Blood and Whiskey. A ton of inaccuracies in that book. She says, ETL send you the newspaper clippings. That said, it doesn't matter. I still love the story you told, as that's the one Connor Motlow believed and shared with Frank Bobo.
Right. So
beautiful.
Connor was one of Jack's nephews, and then Frank Bobo was our distiller at the distillery for eons, from the 50s to the 80s. He really oversaw the distillery during its, the Sinatra boom, and his grandson is now our assistant master distiller, Chris Fletcher. So I think Frank recently passed away. It's really sad. I mean, 90 years old, I believe, and great guy. A couple years ago, I made Chris take me to his house, and I really wanted to meet the guy. He just saw so much of our change and growth and this and that, and I was so excited to meet him. I didn't really think about the obvious, which was how much cool stuff he would have in his house, right? Because he has all these bottles from 40 years. It was amazing. It just had so much stuff, bottles and just cool things. And I think they did an auction. His sister had an auction a couple weeks ago, his collection was pretty mind blowing of different bottles.
I bet. Wow.
Yeah, I can only
Very cool.
imagine.
And just a really sweet guy, just great stories, and just, very much what you would expect from someone that ran the still Jack for all those years. It's a good guy.
Awesome. So, ET and Sailor, are you all ready to drink some whiskey?
Yes.
Before we drink, I mean, I'm already drinking whiskey. We'll get there for a second. Let's answer a few of these questions.
I sneaked a couple sips into.
I did. I couldn't help it because I'm smelling. I like what I smell. Okay, so someone wants to know, Richie, what's your favorite Jack Daniels? And then Nick Griffith, one of our whiskey brothers, wants to know, when did Jack first produce a rye whiskey? Bring that to market.
Beautiful.
Awesome. All right. I guess I'll go first. My favorite is the barrel proof single barrel. And I generally like whiskeys that are higher proof. And that seems, that's pretty common with folks like us who are drinking whiskey as part of our jobs. We drink and taste almost every day, really. Your palate just naturally starts craving a little bit more and a little bit more to satisfy. And so now I generally gravitate towards higher proof whiskeys to really get the punch and the full mouth experience that I really like. And I really like whiskeys that are not filtered between coming out the barrel and going in the bottle. I really like the mouth feel of whiskey is a huge part of the experience for me. And so I like to taste whiskeys that are very rich and thick, and you get that generally from whiskeys that still have their fatty and amino acids in them. And those are the ones that aren't filtered between leaving the barrel and going into the bottle. And so that's generally what I gravitate towards. And this whiskey hits all of those marks for me. And so I really, really like this one. It's very, very viscous. And the best way I can kind of compare or give an analogy for what I'm talking about when I look for in those thick, viscous whiskeys, they're the ones that still have those fatty and amino acids. They're kind of like a grandma's soup that's been made with a ton of butter. It's very thick and viscous, and so the butter is all of those amino acids and fatty acids that are naturally occurring in the whiskey, and those are removed from that pre-bottle filtration. So I like grandma's soup. I like it nice and thick and buttery, and so I gravitate towards whiskeys like that. So this is my choice right here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on a lot of. I mean, at that higher proof, the viscosity is crazy. There's just so much of a mouthfeel, and you get so much flavor. And a lot of people get scared of the proof on barrel proof whiskeys just because it's a big number, but also they don't think it's going to have as much flavor. And I think it's the exact opposite. If you get a really well-made barrel proof whiskey, all the stuff you like in a 80 or 90 proof whiskey are there, but they're just exaggerated. You're getting so much of those vanillas and those caramels and the oak. There's nothing, that changed how it was sitting in that barrel for all those years. So I really find, when you get a good one, I think, there's a couple on the market, Jack being one of, obviously the one I love the most, but, it's a cool concept, and I'm glad it's happening. It also gives customers a really good view of how whiskey is made, right? Because when you're taking a whiskey out of a barrel at 137 proof and to go into market at a much lower proof, you don't really get to see what the distiller gets to see, and now you do. And on that rye question, which has kind of a similar story. We didn't make rye for years. It wasn't what we did at Jack. We made Old Number 7, and rye just became one of those categories that started getting a lot of interest. I really think it was a bartender driven category, because I think a lot of us were reading these old cocktail books and seeing that all these recipes weren't bourbon and Tennessee whiskey. It was rye and brandy.
Yeah.
And rye being such a kissing cousin to bourbon and Tennessee whiskey in the production methods, it was like, hey, let's try rye. And it took us a while because we made it. So our distillers went out and figured out what to do and how they wanted to make a rye. And basically on the market, there's two styles. There's the high rye, 95, 100% rye, and then there's those, I'll call them bourbon ryes, that are just over the legal limit of rye, 51%. So they'll come in at the rye content of 52, 53, and Jeff was like, if we're going to do something, again, Jack did things different. Let's go a little bit different. So he came in the middle with a 70% rye content to really give you the spice you're looking for in a rye, but palatable enough where it's going to be great on its own or on the rocks. So spicy enough for cocktails, but also approachable enough to drink by itself. And the reason I've likened it a little bit to the barrel proof in a way, when we made the rye, right before we put it in the barrel, we released a very limited amount of unaged rye, just so people could say, hey, this is what Jack rye or any rye really tastes like before it goes in the barrel. So it was, basically the moonshine version of rye. And then about 2 years in, we released a rested rye, which was, starting to see where the flavor was going to go, but not quite there, very young rye. And then when we finally were fully finished, the first thing we came out with was a single barrel rye, I believe around 2016. And then about 8 months or a year later, our straight rye came out, the one that's on the market now in the beige and green label. And that's 90 proof. So it's got a little bit more of that body and that rye kind of kick you're looking for in that style of whiskey.
Do you still have that white rye out on the in the market?
No, that's a fun one to find.
I love white rye. I'm very
All right, so now you just won. You won the care package award.
Yay!
By being so patient. I do believe I might know where someone might obtain a bottle of that, and I'd be happy to take care of you.
Well, I will send you one of my favorite white ryes right back to you from a very tiny, lovely family distillery in Ohio, which is absolutely killer. So we'll exchange addresses. I love white rye.
And to go back to our original question, this is why we get along so well and we like each other, because we get to share fun things, right?
Yes.
If we were always duking it out, right?
Exactly.
I wouldn't have a beautiful bottle here. But yeah, no, 2017, the straight rye. What was that?
I said, myth or fact, does Uncle Nearest and Jack Daniel love each other? It is a fact. Confirmed.
100%.
Yes.
Look, I met Fawn, the founder of your company. Obviously her story is great, and her journey to get here is amazing. And I met her very, very early on, and we just kind of hit it off. And we both at the time were living here full time, and she's a very easy woman to like, and we just kind of hit it off. And I've seen her so much over the years. I've seen her speak. I've run it on airplanes, so it's been really cool to watch the whole process of first her doing all this exhaustive research, and I got to go out to the farm with her, and she just showed me some cool stuff she was able to dig up and unearth, which is just great. And we always, I think, kind of felt that book, Jack Daniel's Legacy, told so much of the story, because that author spoke to living people that knew Jack. And then when Fawn got involved and really started tracing the Green family, and some left Lynchburg and went to other cities and never came home, she went and chased them down and got other stories. So it's just a really cool thing to watch unfold. And having being able to know her and talk to her, it's just great. It's just one more asset for me to learn more about not just the history of Jack, but the history of Tennessee and the history of the Green family and just all that really cool stuff. It's great. Because that's what makes this fun, right? Like if every brand was made the same and who cares? But we all have these histories and these stories, and everything's unique. Like the Jack story is the Jack story. Nearest Green's a part of it in Jack's youth. And then the Nearest Green story is the Nearest Green story, and Jack's a part of that story in a little way. And now all these years later, there's a reconnection. It's kind of amazing.
It's
incredible. What would you say if you think about your job today, and then think about your job pre-Fawn Weaver, pre-Uncle Nearest Whiskey? What has our brand coming into the market? How has it changed your narrative as a company, and how has it changed how you go about how you present.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, other than knowing more, it hasn't changed that much. Because like I said, I did a lot of research, and Nearest Green was a part of my story always. And, you know, that great picture of Jack and Nearest son has always been part of the storytelling of Jack. I think because Fawn has uncovered so much more, it's really shined the light on things we thought we knew that we didn't know the full history, and really open up our you know, our history books to this great relationship that, by the way, if you think about the timing of Jack and Nearest, you know, first Jack learning from Nearest and then them working together at that time in history, that itself is an incredible story. And the more that Fawn has uncovered about that relationship and that time in history, and even just Lynchburg in general throughout history, you know, she's really uncovered some great things. So, you know, I guess the biggest change for me is I now have more information. You know, I always knew who Nearest Green was, and, you know, I always knew his kind of great history with Jack Daniels, the man and the brand. Now I know more, you know, and I'm always hoping that whenever I see Fawn, she'll, you know, give me a little nugget that I can take away. It's like we have a historian, you know, Nelson Eddy, and every time I'm in Nashville, you know, if you look at my text thread, it's me, not him, saying, "Hey, can we get lunch? Hey, take you to dinner," because I have questions and he has answers. You know, and it's just so fun to sit down with people like that know so much, and because they don't always know what we want to know, right? What your role is for your company is different from Sherry's role, right? It's different from someone at the distillery. It's different from Fawn's role, really. So Fawn might not know what you need to know out in the world. She might not know what questions are coming at you. But when you can go back to someone like Fawn or me, Nelson or Fawn, or any of the great people, or, you know, that have worked at Jack over these years, and ask questions like, "Oh, you wanted to know that?" I'm like, "Yes. What else do you know?" But they don't know what to tell me because they don't know what I'm tasked with out in the world. So it's my job to really find these people and bug them and be that squeaky wheel that just wants more and more and more, because there's so much history. You know, in the beginning, like I said, it was all music for me. You know, Sinatra, it was Zeppelin, it was the Stones. And then as you uncover it, it's Nearest Green, it's the Motlows, it's all these great things that just weave in and out of the Jack story, and it's it's iconic status, not just here, but like you said, all over the world. And, you know, so for me, it's just more learning, more loving, more giving, more understanding of what we do. Because, you know, if you stop learning, what's the point? If I thought I knew everything about Jack Daniels, you know, how great is this job? It starts plateauing. But the fact that there's so many layers that keep coming up, there's places at the distillery that I've recently been, you know, discovering. I'm like, oh, I didn't know we had this. I didn't know this happened. You know, it's like, it's great. And, you know, you guys are just, I don't want to say starting, because your start is so many years ago, but you're just starting a new chapter, a new journey in the Nearest Green story. And you're there making it. How cool is that? In 150 years, someone will be talking about you guys and what you guys did. So,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
it's amazing.
Yeah, we are. We're starting a new chapter with having our own distillery. And one thing that I thought was just so beautiful that you guys did, and really kind of, for me, just all encompasses and sums up the relationship between our two distilleries, was that you guys, when we opened our distillery in September 5th of last year, you guys did an amazing gesture for us, that I wanted to share with everyone who's watching today. And so we got an email letting us know to check the Tennessean newspaper in the morning, and we weren't exactly sure why. And when we opened the newspaper, there was Jack Daniel had bought a full page advertisement in the Tennessean newspaper, and it was to welcome the Uncle Nearest distillery to the world. So if it's okay with you guys and our viewers, I would just like to read this advertisement that Jack Daniel put in the Tennessean newspaper to welcome the Nearest Green distillery to the world.
And this made us all cry when this came into my email, because I'm in Washington State. I literally shed tears. It was,
Yep.
it's still, it's very emotional.
It's really beautiful, and I just think it is the perfect way to sum up the relationship between our two distilleries and between the people that work at our two distilleries. So this is what the commercial that Jack Daniel Distillery put in the Tennessean back in September. It said, "The folks here at Jack Daniel's in Lynchburg, Tennessee would like to raise a glass and welcome our friends at the new Nearest Green Distillery just outside of Shelbyville. Not only are our two distilleries close when it comes to location, but we also share a history of friendship. Nathan Nearest Green, who the Distillery Visitor Center and Whiskey honor, was our first master distiller and is the man who taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey on the Dan Call farm. He and Nearest had a special relationship at a time when such a friendship was uncommon. The character of each man and the deep respect they had for one another carried forward for generations in the Lynchburg community that they both called home. We know Jack would be proud to see Nearest's name on a distillery just down the road from his. We also know he'd be happy to see that an extraordinary friendship from long ago continues today. And that's something that we can all raise a glass to from your friends at the Jack Daniel Distillery."
I'll raise a glass to that.
I will absolutely raise a glass to that too.
Beautiful.
So cheers, ET. Thank you so much for your time. We absolutely appreciate it. And if there's anything that we can ever do for you guys, you absolutely let us know. We are your friends and brothers in the Tennessee whiskey industry, and we are and brothers and sisters. Jack and Nearest brother.
Dig out of that one on your own time.
Yeah, but we're absolutely here for you, and anything we can do, we always will. So cheers to you, buddy.
The sentiment goes back to you guys, and I look at this kind of stuff as we all travel, and this is what we do for a living. And now I have more friends to come visit when I'm in different cities, and the fact that started with two guys over 150 years ago and is continuing now because of that friendship, it really is heartwarming in such a crazy world that connections are still made and love is still shared. And I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me, and I do cheers you both.
And also, I'd like to do another special cheers to Sherry Moore and Victoria Edie Butler, who are literally carrying on the legacy in their family and their bloodline as well, working together, making whiskey together, just as Jack and Nearest did, which is really amazing as well.
That's great.
Yep. It's all beautiful. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody, for joining
Jack
us.
To Nearest, to whiskey to love. Cheers.
Cheers.
Good night, everyone.